Hello, I am Ollie and today I'm going to talk to you guys about my recent trip to Estancia Maria Behety on the Rio Grande. This is the third time now I've taken a group to this amazing lodge on the Rio Grande River in Argentina. It's a trip that I feel deeply honoured to be able to do every year. This is a river that's become really special to me, not just because of a huge sea trout and the amazing guides and the lodge, but also because it's a place that I once guided at, and it's where I cut my teeth on some of the finest freshwater fishing in the world. Like last year, I had 8 rods travelling with me to Argentina. What was especially great this time is that the group was made up of a bunch of Scots, most of which who had travelled with me last year. So they knew the river pretty well, they could all fish well, and most of all, they were great fun, great crack. The exception, there was a couple of 2 members to the group who, although they'd salmon fished a lot and caught plenty of sea trout, they hadn't experienced the Rio Grande before. I knew that certainly Timmy was extremely excited about this trip. He'd been thinking of it for months, so he was just itching to have his first casts on this amazing river. I don't think he quite realised how special his week was going to be, but within a couple of days of having his first few casts, he sure had one hell of a ride. Just like last year, I met the guys in Buenos Aires a couple of hours behind. They had flown from Edinburgh via Schiphol to Buenos Aires, so arrived a few hours before I did. Once I arrived in Recoleta at the hotel, they'd already had a couple of bottles of wine and were relaxing, enjoying the sun, and probably quite glad to be away from a rather grim January at home. That evening, we went to a restaurant called Fedor, which was within walking distance of the hotel. I've been fortunate to have eaten at a lot of the great steakhouses in Buenos Aires. I can safely say that this was certainly one of the best, and probably better than some of the better known names that you could find on any Google search. It was an exceptional meal and a perfect way to start the week. I think a few of us probably had eyes a little bit too large for our stomach, and it turns out 600 grams of steak when it's on your plate and in front of you is quite a chunk. Every year the internal Aerolíneas Argentinas flights are slightly a law unto themselves. This year we could have flown to Rio Grande, but the timings weren't great because they involved an evening flight arriving early in the morning on the Saturday. Instead, we flew into Ushuaia, which isn't too bad. It takes 3.5 hours in the air. And on the other side, it is a longer transfer, but we could stop at a lovely cafe halfway en route, grab a few empanadas, and in no time we were at the lodge. Returning to EMB, honestly, not too much had changed since the year before, and in all honesty, that's a great thing. We enter the big kind of main living room that's exactly the same, and the girls are the same who are working there, the fantastic chefs are the same, as are the guides, and I can't think of too many lodges where they seem to blend comfort with being quite smart so well. In no way is it remotely pretentious, it's just right. Really comfortable with a fantastic fishing lodge where you don't really need to dress up and you feel completely relaxed at all times. I met up with the head guide, Gennaro. He's now been guiding on the river close to 20 years, if not more, so knows it extremely well, and we discussed the rotation. He recognised quite a lot of the names from last year. What's great is that every day one guide is split between 2 rods and you have a different guide every day, which means that you get a proper feel for the whole of the guide team. All of the guides are fantastic, but you all find that they guide in a slightly different way and have preference for different flies or different theories on the river. They're all extremely knowledgeable, but you can pick up little snippets of information from all of them. What's great about EMB is that you have such a variety of water to fish, from the very downstream beats at 32 all the way to halfway up Counterpen's water. And I know I mentioned this in previous videos, but this allows them to really adapt to the conditions extremely well. It also means that throughout the week you get a really good understanding of the nature of the Rio Grande, because you're fishing quite varied water types that require different techniques, different lines, and often slightly different ways of fishing. The first Saturday when you arrive, really it's just a great opportunity to tackle up, get all of your kit sorted, and relax. You don't actually fish on the Saturday. Your first day's fishing is Sunday and you have a full day. This year on the Rio Grande, the water was on the lower side, probably a similar height to last year, and although low, certainly better condition than when I was on the river 2 years ago. Although it was low, the water temperature was good, and as usual, I like to set up 2 rods for fishing the river. One with a Scandi line and one with a Skagit. Certainly on the lower pools at EMB, being able to fish deeper can be a huge advantage. And if you've only got one set up, it does mean you're having to constantly chop and change, and you're wasting quite a lot of time. Likewise on the upper river, most of the time you just need a Scandi line, because the key to fishing a lot of the smaller water on the upstream beats at EMB is really good presentation and making sure the fly lands really delicately, really gently, and a lot of the time you're using long leaders. So with one rod, the Skagit, I would have a rod of 13 foot or 13'6", in line weights 7 or 8 or 8-9, and a floating Skagit is fine, and then I will use T-tips onto that, and it's always useful to carry really T-tips from 10 foot of T14 all the way up to 12 foot of T18. Although the T18 is a last resort, it can be very useful to have, especially if you're fishing late in the season when you can get really cold evenings and the fishing can be a little bit slow to start with. On the Scandi rod, this year I used my 12'6" 7-weight Hardy a lot because the water wasn't too high, and that's ideal for the water that EMB shares with Counterpen, where it's not too wide and it's upstream of the Menendez, which is the main tributary. Our normal line of attack with this is to start with an intermediate tip and a long leader. To be honest, I like the leader or the tippet to be as long as you can cast and handle, and a long tippet of say 8 foot I think is perfectly reasonable. Most of the guides like to approach the pool with the most delicate tactic to start with, and that means Scandi line, an intermediate poly leader and a long tippet. That's what they'll use for the first pass through, and if nothing happens then they'll start going through the layers and slowly fishing deeper. With regards to tippet, I do have a preference for fluorocarbon on the Rio Grande above copolymer. The reason why is because the water is clear, and I do feel like fluorocarbon can give you the edge. I don't like fishing too light, usually no lighter than 15 pounds, and to be honest, most of the time I'll be using 20 pounds during the daytime as we move into evening, or if the water's coloured and you're using large leeches, I might use 23 pounds, and when you're using the big leeches in the dark, 25 pounds is great because it means if you get a wind knot, you don't need to worry about it too much. And when it's really dark, the fish are not leader shy, especially when you're using flies this large. On the first day, the Sunday, the morning was a little slow because of the bright conditions, and it had been quite a cold evening. So at lunch, I was a little bit nervous because although a few had caught fish, no one had had a particularly lights out session. For the afternoon session, I joined Gordon and Stuart, who were fishing downstream on a beach that holds a pool called Leandro's, otherwise known as Fish Factory by Estancia Maria. We stood on the high bank, getting a feel for what was happening. I was next door. I had Gennaro on my shoulder, and it wasn't long before we started to see fish roll. The boys went down below the high bank, and it was within 5 minutes Gordon had hooked up using a small size 12 EMB, and the fish took him halfway through his running line, tail walking into the distance. It wasn't a huge fish, but it was a very solid 14-pound tide fresh sea trout. That session the guys caught 5 fish between them, and the smallest was about 13 pounds I think. The largest didn't break 15, but all of the fish were between 13 and 14 pounds. Stunning fish, not a blemish on any of them, and really it was such a great way for them to start the week. Back at the lodge, a similar story. Most of the team had caught some good fish, and I was very relieved that we started the week off with a bang. The following day proved a steady day for everyone really, and what was really interesting to see this year, and this was a trend that followed throughout the week, certainly on our week, was the abundance of fish of 10 pounds and up. We caught very few fish below 8 pounds. I know it was early in the season, so likelihood is that a lot of them hadn't quite run in yet, which can often be the case, but the average size throughout the week was something like 10 pounds, and if you hooked into a fish, you kind of expected it to be at least 12 pounds, which is pretty extraordinary considering at home that's the fish of a lifetime. Now Timmy, as I mentioned before, it was his first trip, and on the second evening he was fishing a pool called Alejandro's, which is a well-known big fish pool. And for Timmy this certainly proved to be the case, because that evening he landed a stunning cockfish that was just shy of 24 pounds, and to be honest that's a fish of a lifetime even on the Rio Grande. And as Timmy said, it might be my second evening, but as far as I'm concerned my week is pretty much done, and that truly was a magical fish. But it turned out it wasn't quite done for Timmy, because he caught plenty of other fish. Throughout the week, the lower beats at EMB's water tend to fish slightly better than the upper beats. That's quite normal for early season, because it does take a little bit of time for the fish to move through the system. That's not to say we didn't have good fishing on the upper beats, but you knew the density of fish wasn't quite as much. This obviously, once you move into the latter part of January, changes, and there's a really good spread of fish throughout. I always quite like fishing the upper beats though, even in the early season, because although you know the density of fish isn't quite as much, the water's quite shallow, and I do find if you do find fish, they can take really well. And some of the most exciting fishing I've had has been on the smaller water with switch rods and my small 12'6" 7 weight. While we fished a range of tactics, generally speaking a Scandi line proved the most effective and fishing high on the surface. I think a lot of this was because the fish hadn't been in the river all that long, and if they wanted to take, they would happily take closer to the surface. Just like salmon, the sea trout that haven't been in the river quite so long do tend to take a little bit better. We used the normal range of flies from small EMBs and green machines up to bigger sun rays and leeches at night. Yet again, an EMB is quite hard to beat and proved one of the most successful flies of the week, as did a sunray. The sunray was also very effective, and I do find a sunray, if you're searching for fish, much like with salmon, it can be an excellent pattern. I think a lot of the time on the Rio Grande, it's not about having a huge quantity of flies, it's about having a small selection of patterns in different sizes and different weights, and more than anything it's about presenting the fly properly, and this is where all of the guides come in handy. Although a lot of the guides will tell you how they want you to fish the pool, it's really worth asking as many questions as possible and make those questions really specific, because a lot of the pools on the Rio Grande, they can be very large and take quite a long time to fish, but the actual taking spot where they're catching most of the fish could be condensed into an area of 5 or 10 meters, and it's really worth focusing a lot of attention on that area and fiddling with the angle of your casting and how you're mending and the depth and also the strip. The Rio Grande tends not to award fishermen who chuck and chance quite as well as the ones who have a more thoughtful approach, and constant tinkering with casting angles, how you're mending and how you're stripping can really be the key to success. One of the themes we really saw, as I've mentioned before, was the quantity of really good solid fish during our week, and all of the guys had commented just how good the fishing had been when we had been there this season. At EMB you got the fishing book, and of course they will record every fish that they catch over a certain size, but in the book, to get your name in that book, it's got to be 15 pounds and up. And what was fantastic to see was every single member of the party of all 8 rods had caught a fish of 15 pounds and up, and quite a few had caught more than that. Jamie had had a cracking 19-pound fish. Stuart had also had a 19-pound fish. Timmy, of course, got his huge 24-pound fish. Gordon had had a 19-pound fish as well. Alan had a 17-pound fish. Mark had a 16. Jamie's son, had had a 16 also. And Sean had had several fish over 15. It was really an unbelievable week, just in terms of the quality of the fish the guys were catching. And the delight with this time of the season is the fish they were catching were absolute bars of silver. They couldn't have been stronger. The takes were often savage, ripping the rod out of your hand. And it's really one of the reasons why I love this time of the year, is you're catching really good quality fish. And of course, everyone wants to catch that fish over 20 pounds, but the reality is the best fight you can get is normally from a hen fish between 15 and 17 pounds. A really fresh hen, that's the kind of fish that will cartwheel through the pool, ripping off line and really take with such incredible aggression. Now, we had been a party of 8 rods. Usually EMB takes 12. They have a sister lodge further downstream that rotates through the same water at La Vigia. They take 6 rods. And by the end of the week, on average, the guys have had about 10 fish each. And that's, I'd say, fairly common for the Rio Grande. And I think that's a realistic expectation for most anglers who are travelling there. It's not a fishery where you're pulling fish out every cast. It's a fishery where you do work hard. Some sessions you will struggle a little, and a lot of that will be down to the beat you're on at the time. Also, sea trout are notoriously moody fish, but you will also, throughout the week, you will always hit a golden patch. And as I always say to the group, you will have your moment, you just have to stick at it. And all of the guys have had their moment and had exceptional fishing. I think often that's why people keep returning to the Rio Grande, and especially EMB, because it is challenging, but the rewards can be the sea trout of a lifetime. And a sea trout of a lifetime in Argentina is a bigger sea trout than you're going to catch anywhere else in the world. The fishing day at EMB does change throughout the season, and that's to make the most of the evening hours, because you will find that last hour of light is when you can catch a lot of the fish. And even though the day can be a little tough sometimes, the last hour of light can be absolutely magical, and the fish can turn on, and every single cast you can be having a nip, a pull, or the rod ripped out of your hand. Usually the guides meet you in the morning after breakfast at about 8 or 8:30, and then you'll have a solid morning session until lunch at 1 o'clock, and lunch will be your biggest meal of the day. After that you can have a nice long siesta, and especially we were early in the season where the daylight hours are longest, we wouldn't go back onto the river until 7 in the evening, but usually lines up were about 11:30 at night. And it does mean you're finishing late, but you really need to make the most of that last hour of light. The food at the lodge was fantastic, as it always is, especially if you like meat. Most of the meat, the beef and the lamb comes from the estancia. EMB is family run, and it's a working estancia at the same time. They have a huge flock of merino sheep, and it means that you've got an on-tap supply of some of the best meat you'll find anywhere. And they love to cook, as they often do in Argentina, over open fires. This year, what was of note was that the puddings were absolutely exceptional, and having a slightly sweet tooth myself, this was quite something, and really had been commented on by the rest of my team just how especially good everything had been this year. On the final Saturday, we packed up and we returned to Ushuaia for our flight back to Buenos Aires. That evening, we again stayed in Recoleta and again ate at Fedor, which, as it usually seems to be, was a fantastic meal and really the perfect way to round off what had been a very special week in Argentina. For me, of course, fishing is the primary focus when you go on a trip like this, but what I find especially rewarding about Argentina is the trip as a whole. I'm not a city person, I'd be the first to say that, but Buenos Aires is a fantastic city, and you might only be going to fish for a week, but having a day or a night either side of that week in this great city really does add to the trip, and it helps seal off what is a fantastic trip, and for what was for us a really very memorable week. I'm delighted to say that all of the guys are planning on returning next year for the same week, and it really sums up EMB and the river itself in that it just has a way of crawling under your skin, and once you catch that bug, it seems a terrible shame for that not to be part of your annual calendar. Once again, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.